Our main story tonight concerns crime. Once again, voted #1 by Reasons to Tiptoe magazine. Specifically, we're going to talk about corporate crime, something our current president is famously not that concerned about. Not only was he convicted on 34 counts of falsifying business records, but long before he was president, CNBC ran a segment about a law banning American companies from bribing foreign governments. And I'll let this anti-corruption activist pick up the story from there.
I was asked to come on CNBC and give the anti-corruption argument. And I remember laughing at the time saying, well, is there somebody that you found who's willing to give the pro-corruption argument?
Now, every other country goes into these places and they do what they have to do. Sad part, every other country in the world is doing it. We're not allowed to. So it puts us at a huge disadvantage.
Yeah, they clearly got the right guy there. I can only assume the producer at CNBC said to their assistant, we need someone willing to give the pro-corruption argument. Who's the most unethical person you can think of? To which they replied, easy, the Hamburglar. To which the producer said, no, wait, what? No, like a real person. To which they said, wait, the Hamburglar's not real? To which the producer said, no, he's a fictional character. To which the assistant replied, well, there goes that dream. To which the producer said, what dream? To which they said, of marrying the Hamburglar. To which the producer said, I'm sorry, what? To which the assistant said, let's not talk about it. How about we get Donald Trump? To which the producer said, oh, that is a good idea. Are you crying? To which the assistant said, yeah, sorry, this Hamburglar news is just hitting me pretty hard. To which the producer said, did you really have a crush on a cartoon beef thief? To which they replied, the heart wants what it wants! Before storming off to go cry in the bathroom stall. Anyway, the point is, of course they got Donald Trump to defend corruption on live TV. And since taking office, his administration's halted or dropped more than 100 enforcement actions against corporate misconduct. And he even issued the first ever pardon of a corporation, pardoning this cryptocurrency exchange, which had been sentenced to a $100 million fine for violating an anti-money laundering law. It is frankly no wonder experts have called this moment the ripest environment for corruption by public officials and business executives in a generation. Though, to be fair, it's not like the environment was exactly unripe before Trump took office. Republican and Democratic administrations have both taken a pretty lax approach to corporate crime for a while now. You might have noticed, stories about corporate malfeasance rarely end with executives going to jail or the companies getting shut down. And tonight's story is going to focus on a key reason for that: Deferred Prosecution Agreements, or DPAs. They're basically an out-of-court settlement for companies to avoid being prosecuted. Essentially, the government will come to a company and say, hi, company, government here, you did a crime and we have enough evidence to prosecute you. But instead of then doing that, they strike a deal where if the company behaves itself for a certain amount of time, the criminal charges eventually disappear. Sometimes they'll go with an even weaker option, a non-prosecution agreement, or NPA, which doesn't even have to be filed in court. But either way, they're terms that tend to slide past you whenever you hear them on the news.
The Justice Department announcing a deferred prosecution agreement with Teva Pharmaceuticals.
First Energy entered into what's called a deferred prosecution agreement.
McKinsey has also entered into a deferred prosecution agreement.
Uber has entered into a non-prosecution agreement.
Credit Suisse close to finalizing that deferred prosecution agreement.
What's known as a deferred prosecution agreement.
Deferred prosecution agreement.
Deferred prosecution agreement.
Every bank on Wall Street has a deferred prosecution or an NPA. Every bank has more than one, most likely.
It's true. AIG has 2 NPAs and a DPA. Barclays has a DPA and an NPA. Credit Suisse has a DPA. JP Morgan has an NPA and a DPA. Lloyds has 2 DPAs. The Royal Bank of Scotland has a DPA. Wachovia has a DPA and an NPA. And UBS has a DPA and 2 NPAs. And just so you know, when I say a sentence like, UBS has a DPA and 2 NPAs, I do hear myself. I'm fully aware that one day this show will just be me reading one long acronym for 40 minutes. We'll have achieved our perfect form, and on that day, I'll finally be allowed to die. But the point is, these agreements are absolutely everywhere. Honestly, the only things more ubiquitous than DPAs on Wall Street are fleece vests and undiagnosed sociopaths. Unfortunately, as you're about to see, DPAs don't really do much. In fact, sometimes companies that have done massive harm have used them to literally get away with murder. So given that, tonight, let's talk about deferred prosecution agreements, where they came from, how ineffective they can be, and a few amazing examples of what they can look like in practice. Let's start with the fact that DPAs were never actually intended to be used on corporations. The concept grew out of a 1974 law that was meant to help first-time and juvenile non-violent offenders avoid prosecution so they could focus on rehabilitation. But that is not how we use them today. And you can trace the explosion of corporate DPAs back to one of the most famous times a large company was prosecuted in this country, Arthur Andersen. It was the accounting firm for Enron, whose name is now synonymous with accounting fraud. Very basically, with the help of Andersen, Enron completely invented future earnings for itself. And when the government tried to investigate, Andersen undertook a massive document purge during which they deleted around 30,000 computer files and emails, and at one point shredded more documents in 3 days than they usually destroyed in a year. Something that became so famous, it was even parodied in a Heineken commercial, where the documents became snowflakes, and the tagline was, "To all those who weren't naughty this year, happy holidays." And just think how remarkable that is. A beer company thought to themselves, you know, we could just show off our crisp, refreshing product in this commercial, but instead, let's give people what they really want this Christmas and say fuck you to an accounting firm. But the thing is, the Justice Department actually got a lot of blowback for prosecuting Andersen because at the time, it was a massive firm with 28,000 employees, many of whom felt like they'd done nothing wrong.
After weeks of suffering in silence, Andersen workers have found their voice.
Fight, stand tall, don't give up. By the grace of God, we're gonna win because we're Andersen.
Everybody you see out here is worried about their job right now.
We're all being penalized for something that we didn't have anything to do with.
Yeah, Arthur Andersen's employees felt a range of emotions, from resentment to anxiety to a level of unbridled exuberance, best described as Price is Right contestant who just won a Honda Civic. And they were right to be concerned. Andersen being convicted of a felony meant they lost their accounting licence, which, for an accounting firm, is generally not great for business. The company eventually folded, thousands of people lost their jobs, and many, like this Andersen partner, placed the blame squarely on the government.
In the history of the world of business, this will come out, in my judgment, as the largest act of corporate murder ever.
OK, that is a wild overstatement, though, because what happened to Andersen is a lot more complicated than that. The company had started shedding clients long before their conviction, and the SEC was already investigating them. So the truth is, Andersen was likely heading out of business anyway. Saying this prosecution is what doomed Andersen is like saying that the ground is what doomed the Hindenburg. Sure, it might have been the final issue it encountered, but things weren't exactly smooth sailing before then. But after Andersen, prosecutors became very reluctant to risk putting a company out of business, and that is when DPAs became popular. In the decade prior to Andersen's collapse, DPAs and NPAs had been used just 18 times. But in the 14 years following, the DOJ entered into 419 such settlements. And the argument for DPAs is that they prevent innocent employees from getting hurt, dissuade future wrongdoing, and still allow the DOJ to go after individuals. But there are problems with literally all that. For starters, nearly half of those getting deferred and non-prosecution agreements paid no fine at all. And when it comes to individuals, in 2/3 of cases, no employees were prosecuted. And to show you just how glaringly apparent this system's shortcomings can be, we're going to focus on 3 companies: GM, HSBC, and Boeing. We actually talked about GM all the way back in our first season, but just in case I wasted my precious, let's call it youth, shouting at you about things you don't remember, here is a quick refresher on what the company did wrong.
Last year, GM began recalling 2.5 million cars with ignition switches that could suddenly shut off the engine, cutting off the power to the airbags and disabling the power steering and power brakes, causing crashes. GM has since determined that the switches caused accidents that led to 124 deaths and 273 injuries.
Yeah, it was a wild story. GM sold cars with faulty switches that could shut off the engine, steering, brakes, and airbags, despite the fact that they are, and this is true, some of the key differences between something being an automobile or a metal coffin moving at 70 miles an hour. And there was evidence the company knew about the problem. In 2008, they showed their employees a PowerPoint encouraging them to avoid words like problem, safety, and defect when writing about GM's cars, and added as a fun joke that they should also probably stay away from terms like Kevorkian-esque, tomb-like, maniacal, or rolling sarcophagus. And I kind of hope that that just inspired GM employees to use other options instead, like the Widowmaker, Chitty Chitty Smash Bang, Final Destination, the car, and the lean, mean James Dean machine. GM reached a DPA with the government in 2015, which meant they didn't have to plead guilty, just agree to a statement of facts about their misconduct. For instance, they admitted that by early 2012, they not only knew about the problem, they were aware of several fatal incidents that may have been caused by the defective switch. And while the law required GM to report such knowledge to the government within 5 days, it took them approximately 20 months, which, fun fact, is around the length of an elephant's gestational period. And if writing an email takes longer than making a fucking elephant from scratch, there is clearly something else going on. Now, as part of GM's DPA, they did have to pay a $900 million fine, and Mary Barra, their then and current CEO, went to great lengths to argue that the deal was not letting them off easy.
This is a tough agreement. It further highlights the mistakes that were made by certain people in GM, and it imposes significant penalties and obligations.
OK, but I don't know how significant a $900 million fine was to a company whose profits were just under $10 billion that year. I'm not saying it's nothing, but 9% of 1 year's profits just doesn't seem enough for essentially marketing the automotive equivalent of the Titan submersible. Also, while she said mistakes were made by certain people at GM, notably, no individuals ended up facing charges for any part of this. And that's something extra galling for people like Candice Anderson. She lost control of her car in a crash that killed her boyfriend. And when GM conducted an internal review of the accident in 2007, they ruled that their car was to blame. Unfortunately, they never told anyone that, instead allowing Candice to plead guilty to negligent homicide 5 months later. Thankfully, her conviction has since been overturned, but the way that she sees it, that's not nearly enough.
There's someone within General Motors that should be held responsible.
Are you saying that you think individuals at General Motors should stand trial?
Yeah, I do. They didn't have a problem sitting by while I was charged.
Yeah, I get that. If someone does something terrible to you, it is understandable to want them to get a taste of their own medicine. It's one of the many reasons why I personally love to see someone shit on a pigeon. Yeah, not so much fun when we do it to you, is it, pigeons? And look, thankfully, GM hasn't killed any more people with its cars since then as of taping. But other companies with DPAs have shown a much greater propensity for recidivism. And that brings us to our second example, HSBC. A few years back, it got in trouble for allowing Mexican cartels to launder at least $881 million in drug trafficking proceeds and facilitating approximately $660 million in transactions involving sanctioned regimes like Burma, Iran, Cuba and Libya. Here is how bad it was. At one point, Mexican law enforcement recorded a cartel leader on a wiretap saying HSBC was the place to launder money. And the Sinaloa cartel deposited so much money in their bank that the cartel designed special cash boxes to fit HSBC's teller windows, which is surprisingly considerate in a way. After all, who hasn't been stuck in a teller line behind some guy trying to stuff a blood-soaked duffel full of cash through the window? Finally, a cartel that thinks about other people's time. Now, in response, HSBC put together a new compliance department, but it wasn't exactly inspiring, as this man will tell you. His name is Everett Stern, and he once had a dream. Tell everyone about your dream, Everett.
Sure. My dream was to join the CIA.
OK, thanks, Everett. That sounds like a really nice dream. Unfortunately, Everett got rejected by the CIA, but he did get hired as a compliance officer at HSBC, which he was excited about, until he got there.
I remember, like, my first day on the job. It was a shopping center. It wasn't like a bank building. I was expecting to show up at this bank building, and I'm in this suit. There were all these people, like, in jeans and T-shirts, and I didn't understand what was going on. And when I walked in, there were all these empty cubicles, and the walls were half painted, and there were maybe 15 compliance officers in the whole department. At the time, I thought I was like this. They hired me because I was like this smart guy, and I had it all going and everything. And no, they hired me because I was an idiot and I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah, as far as Everett could see, HSBC was intentionally looking to hire idiots, and the only time that is an acceptable hiring strategy is if you're casting a baby food commercial. We need to hire, one of those tiny idiots who doesn't know what they're doing. Oh, a baby. Sorry, a baby. That's the word. We need to hire a baby. And while HSBC was going through the motions of compliance publicly, internally, they were going to egregious lengths to avoid it altogether. For example, the Treasury keeps a list of sanctioned organisations that banks aren't allowed to do business with. On that list is a company called Tajka, which has had ties to Hezbollah. HSBC system should have automatically flagged any transactions involving Tajka, and yet even a self-described idiot who didn't know what he was doing could quickly see that the bank was processing thousands of dollars for them. And I'll let him describe how he discovered it and what he did next.
I noticed they were putting little dots and dashes in the actual names in the wire filter. So, for instance, if you had Tajiko that was sending money from Hezbollah to some other organization, instead of TAJCO, that's the normal name for it, in the HSBC wire filter, it would be TAJ.CO or TAJ-CO. And that's how they criminally manipulated the wire filter to allow money laundering for terrorists and drug cartels. This is why 3 weeks in, I started passing information to the CIA.
Fuck yeah, you did, Everett! Fuck yeah, you did! That is great news for him, and frankly, terrible news for whoever thought it was a good idea to hire an aspiring CIA officer to oversee your extremely lazy attempts to launder money for criminals. And once the government started poking around within HSBC, they quickly found some pretty compelling evidence.
Internal documents show HSBC executives knew exactly what they were doing. We are allowing organized criminals to launder their money, wrote one executive.
Wow. It is hard to imagine how the evidence could get more damning than that, unless maybe the email signature included the phrase, "sent from my crime phone," followed by the shh emoji. And yet, incredibly, the government brought no charges against individuals. The bank itself just got a DPA, and the terms of it seems more than a little weak. For example, it agreed to pay a fine of almost $2 billion, which might sound like a lot until you remember they made over $13 billion in profits that year alone. And look, maybe the DOJ really thought that a hefty but entirely manageable fine would make HSBC change their ways. And the bank did agree to monitoring, and apparently even issued their US-based staff certificates with little parrots on them reading, "I am a changed bird." But were they? Because even that monitoring programme illustrates something immensely frustrating here. Because DPAs aren't criminal proceedings, monitoring reports on whether or not companies are complying aren't required to be public record. So we don't really know what HSBC did to clean up its act. But the glimpses we got during that period aren't great. As in the bank's own annual report, they openly admitted that their monitor expressed significant concerns about the pace of their progress and instances of potential financial crime. But despite that, their DPA expired as planned at the end of 2017, and the government dropped all charges against them. So they were in the clear until the very next month when this happened.
HSBC is said to have agreed to pay $100 million to resolve a US Justice Department investigation into the rigging of currency rates. A source tells Bloomberg the deal includes a deferred prosecution agreement and a promise to help with the criminal case against former traders.
Yeah, they were caught again and they got another DPA. That is ridiculous. At this point, it's not even a deferred prosecution agreement. It's more like prosecutorial edging. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, let the government come. And that is the thing here. DPAs and their associated fines have now become a routine cost of doing business, which is a real problem because the stakes can be incredibly high, which brings us to our final company, Boeing. Last year, we did a whole segment about its fall from grace and discussed their infamous 737 MAX planes, which have been involved in 2 devastating crashes that killed 346 people. I won't recap the whole thing, but suffice to say, there were flaws with the aircraft's design, and they weren't exactly a secret within the company.
The 737 MAX became Boeing's best-selling jet ever. But in 2017, just as the planes were taking to the skies worldwide, a Boeing employee sent this message to a colleague. This airplane is designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. Other employees calling the design piss poor and comparing the fixes to patching a leaky boat. In October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610, 737 MAX, crashed, killing 189 people on board. In May of that year, as Boeing was pursuing FAA approval for the MAX flight simulator, one test pilot wrote, "I'll be shocked if the FAA approves this turd."
Yeah. It seems like the only real disagreement within Boeing was on what hilarious language to use when describing their catastrophic products. OK, so we got piss poor, leaky boat, turd. You know what, can someone get GM on the phone and see if we can borrow Kevorkian-esque from them? I kind of like the sound of that. Following those crashes, Boeing entered into a DPA in 2021, admitting to misrepresentations to regulators about a key software feature tied to the crashes. It also agreed to pay a fine and show 3 years of good behaviour in exchange for avoiding prosecution. It's agreement that many felt was toothless, especially given that one judge involved with the case later called what Boeing had done the deadliest corporate crime in US history. And following that DPA, things didn't seem to improve much at Boeing, because by the start of 2024, just 2 days before their 3-year probationary period was set to end, this happened.
What was supposed to be a short trip from Portland to Ontario, California for Garrett Cunningham turned out to be one of the most frightening experiences of his life.
A gush of air, I look to my left and part of the plane is gone.
Yeah, not ideal. It is never good when you feel a sudden gush of air on a flight. Even if the plane hasn't just cracked open, odds are it's going to be the toddler in the seat behind you breathing directly on your face, or your seatmate cracking the lid on a tub of tuna salad they brought with them. There is no surprise whoosh of air that brings good tidings in a metal sky can. But in this case, yeah, a door plug blew off a 737 MAX mid-flight, an incident that was a clear indication, according to the DOJ, Boeing had violated its initial DPA. But instead of then prosecuting them, the DOJ offered them a plea deal, which just required them to pay another fine, boost their spending on safety and compliance programs, and report to an independent monitor overseeing their compliance. And this understandably angered some of the family members of crash victims. Here is the mother of one of them summing it all up.
It seemed that beginning of January, just 2 days before the expiration of the DPA, oops, I did it again. This is Boeing's song. Oops, I did it again.
Yeah, that woman's outrage is completely justified, and it's honestly smart to cite the musical canon of Britney Spears, given that Boeing essentially just pled not that innocent. But it gets worse. Because this year, the Trump administration downgraded Boeing's punishment to a non-prosecution agreement, removing even the hypothetical chance of prosecuting them over this in the future, which is just completely infuriating, unless, I guess, you're this guy on CNBC who chose to announce the news like this.
The DOJ says it expects to file the written agreement with Boeing by the end of the week. Should be viewed as good news. I wouldn't be surprised to see the stock move higher.
Yeah! Great news, everyone. The stock should move higher. So I guess that's at least one thing that Boeing can keep in the fucking air. But even if that is good news for stockholders, it's clearly not great for anyone else, because while it means that Boeing does have to pay out an additional $444 million into a crash victims fund, they also avoid being branded a convicted felon and will no longer face oversight by an independent monitor, but instead will hire a compliance consultant. As one consumer rights advocate puts it, this deal isn't even a slap on the wrist, it's barely a feather on the wrist. Look, clearly, when it comes to corporate accountability, we have a problem here. Because a company engages in flagrant misbehaviour, even putting evidence of it in writing, people get hurt, they're caught red-handed, the government fines them and says, you better not do that again, then they do, and the whole cycle restarts. This is not sustainable. And unfortunately, I wouldn't expect any of that to change for at least, say, 3.5 years. But it is worth asking, for a hypothetical future when we have a government that isn't run by a pro-corruption felon, what could we be doing better to hold corporations accountable? Well, we could make DPAs more of a deterrent by making the fines much more serious and prosecuting executives a lot more often. We could also bring both DPAs and NPAs into the official legal system so that their monitoring would be more transparent and companies would build up records of misconduct instead of constantly getting to wipe their slate clean. But the hard truth here is, if we want more accountability, the government is going to have to show more willingness to prosecute repeat offenders, even if it affects a large company's ability to do business. Which really doesn't seem too much to ask, because you've seen tonight just how much damage companies can do when they operate unchecked. And right now, we have a system where essentially corporations can, with very limited resistance, sell cars with a surprise off button, operate as a haven for blood money, and build planes that unbuild themselves in the sky. And I'd argue that to not make significant changes to a system like that would be, if I may quote GM's most cursed PowerPoint of all time, fucking maniacal.